Hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's program. We're going to get started in just a minute. We're letting some more folks trickle in, so just hold tight. Hi, good evening for those of you who are just joining us. We'll get started in just a minute. We still have some more people logging on, it looks like. Okay, it looks like we've kind of slowed down on entering, so we can get started. Good evening, everybody. My name is Cathy Wise. I'm the Director of Community Education with Audubon Southwest. We're really excited to have everybody here tonight for our Starting from Seeds Native Plants webinar. This is the first webinar we're starting for our spring season, so it feels very appropriate to be starting with plants. Just so everyone knows, this is a webinar, so you should be on mute, and just to keep yourselves on mute for the rest of the program for the out of consideration out of everybody else. Also noting that this program is being recorded, so we're going to post a recording on our YouTube channel following this, but if you don't want to be recorded, feel free to turn off your camera and just sit back and listen and enjoy. Just some housekeeping and Zoom basics. I know we're a year into Zoom, but for those of you who might not spend 8 hours a day on Zoom, here's a basic rundown. Like I mentioned, please keep yourselves on mute. So you should see a little button on the bottom left. If you have questions or things, feel free to enter them in the chat. You should see a little bubble down at the middle of the screen. We're going to have a Q&A at the very end with Danielle and Cathy. So we'll be sure to get to all of those questions that we can. If you're having trouble connecting, as I know that I have been having some internet struggles today, feel free to turn off your video, and sometimes that helps with the sound and the quality and the streaming. And also, just so everyone is aware, we do have closed captioning enabled for this webinar. So you can see with that little CC button, you can turn it on and enable it. If you find the subtitles distracting, which some folks do, there's also an option to hide them, so you don't have to see the little words scrolling down at the bottom of the screen. If you have other technical problems, feel free to send a direct message to me through the chat, and I'll see what I can do if I can help you out. So like I said, welcome to tonight's program. This is the first of a whole slew of awesome conservation programs that we're going to be offering over the next couple of months. We are starting with our native plants, and in a couple of weeks, we're going to be moving on to featuring some of our different conservation programs, like our conservation ranching is coming up next on April 13th. It's going to feature our fearless leader, John Hayes, who's our executive director, talking about a really cool partnership between ranchers, conservationists, scientists, trying to help the grasslands. Later on Earth Day, we're going to have a special climate change featured webinar featuring Tice, who's our director of bird conservation, who's going to be sharing about our recent climate change report that came out a couple of years ago out of Audubon. You can see we're going to be covering water, policy, beer, which is a pretty fun one. So be sure to follow us on our social media pages or sign up for our newsletter. Those are both ways to stay connected with us and hear about upcoming programs. Cathy and I are also going to make sure we plan some more native plant programs. We haven't figured them out yet. They'll be later in the summer and the fall. We just haven't gotten that far. So if you stay connected, you'll be alerted when we have those coming up. And I will post a link to our newsletter sign up sheet in the chat in just a second. So that way you can go sign up after this. I will also mention that tonight's program is offered free, and it is sponsored by some great partners from Waste Management and the APS Foundation. We do appreciate, though, if you are able to give a donation. That does help us. We are a nonprofit with a pretty small staff over 2 really big states. So anything you are able to contribute does help us provide on-the-ground conservation for birds, habitats, and also provide education experiences to people like you, adults, kids, everybody in between. So we do appreciate any support you're able to give. And now I'm going to pass it over to our community science manager, Cathy Wise, who's going to introduce tonight's speaker.
Hey everybody, thank you for being here tonight. We are so pleased to have Danielle Carlock with us. She has been gardening in the desert for about 10 years and has a native garden in Scottsdale with over 150 species. She recently founded the Maricopa Seed Library as a way to distribute free seed to the community and to promote the use of native plants in the landscape, with a special emphasis on supporting pollinators. And birds are pollinators too, remember that. She has taught biology at high school and college level and is currently a library faculty member at Scottsdale Community College. I hope that all of you will join us for our future webinars. We're hoping to have one per season. And so starting out with seeds and starting out with Danielle is just, it's really exciting. And thank you for being here. And I'm gonna hand it over to Danielle.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let me get that in slide share view. Okay, just going to go ahead and advance. So as far as we're going to cover, 3 main topics tonight, just to really briefly, a little bit of information about the Maricopa Native Seed Library, in case you'd like to utilize us. And then I'll talk about native plants as far as how do you define a native plant? What are they and why are they important? Why should I consider incorporating them into my home landscape? And then we'll get into how to start native plants from seed. We'll talk about different germination techniques, different techniques to sow the seeds, and then some of the specifics about, the potting medium and the mulch. We'll also talk about seed balls, which is another maybe more innovative way to sow seeds. We'll talk about that. And then what native plants are easy to grow from seed. So just a couple of slides here on the Maricopa Native Seed Library. So as Cathy said, I'm a faculty member at Scottsdale Community College, and I started the Seed Library as a sabbatical project this year. It falls under the Maricopa Community Colleges. And overall, the goal is to equip the community to include more native plants in their home landscapes in order to provide habitat at home. What you might think of as a living landscape, which I'll talk more about, and to try to reach as many people as possible. The Seed Library is using a distributed model. We have locations at 3 colleges right now, and then we're also doing just a pilot mail order seed distribution, but that's not going to go on too much longer. That was really just to try to get seeds out during the height of the pandemic, and that won't be able to be continued as an ongoing service. But if you check out our website, you'll see for the most updated information about where to obtain seeds. And besides seed distribution, we're doing a few other things. I've been building, actually adding to the gardens that are already present at SCC and at Red Mountain campus, adding seed library species, so that when things get a little bit back to normal and people can come on campus normally, they can walk through the gardens and look at the plants and see the actual plants that are available at the seed library, and then go into the library and make their selection. So stay tuned for more information about that. Also been doing workshops such as this and others. There's some recordings on the website that are all free recordings, and I think I have them on my YouTube site as well. Working on some lessons for high school and non-majors biology students. And a big project going on right now is getting ready to have some interns come on board, hopefully over the summer, and participate in seed collecting and doing a lot of the work that goes into the seed library and learning by doing. So that's just a really brief overview of the seed library. And I just put up this slide because I wanted to just talk about, my background is purely, I don't really have horticulture training. I have a science background, but as far as actual gardening, I don't have any, I guess, formal training. My training came from this backyard, which I got in 2011 as a home foreclosure, and really had nothing had ever been really grown there. Except weeds. And then I started adding native plants. And so this has been my teacher. By living with these plants kind of day in and day out and season by season, I've gotten to know them. And you can see the pictures show kind of the same orientation. This is an ironwood that I put in early on. And then you can see it over here. It's growing it back behind the Palo Verde. So it's generally the same orientation. So you just kind of see. But, my yard is kind of overboard. I mean, 150 species is not necessary to provide good wildlife habitat. So you could definitely do a lot with a lot less. So we'll talk about that a bit as well. And my direct email address is there as well. So let's talk about what constitutes a native plant. And this can be a little bit, I don't want to say controversial, but the definitions can vary a little bit, but I've posted up here two that come from organizations that I think kind of reflect, what maybe is kind of a consensus on native plant. If you look over the definitions, a plant that is part of the balance of nature that has developed over hundreds or thousands of years in a particular region or ecosystem. And then an alternative one from US Fish and Wildlife, with respect to a particular ecosystem, a species that, other than as a result of an introduction, historically occurred or currently occurs in an ecosystem. So you can see that kind of the common thread is this idea that the plant has been in that location for quite a long time. And I think maybe what might be a little bit controversial or up to debate about native plants is in the Americas, in North and South America. Well, where do you draw the line, with that? And so typically that's been drawn at any plants that were brought over during European settlement and colonization would be considered introduced and not native plants. So anything that was here prior to European contact, settlement, and colonization would be considered native plants to North America, let's say. And so that's sort of kind of the rule of thumb. And kind of really, I think the most important point on this slide, and maybe one of the most important points of the presentation, is why native plants are important. And the reason is that because they've been in this location for a long period of time, they have co-evolved with the other organisms here, birds, insects. And so they've developed these relationships, these long-standing relationships, and they've co-evolved together, which really relates to why they're so important, because you won't find the same relationships. An introduced plant or an invasive species will not have the same relationships that has developed over time with the other organisms in that environment. And so another important point about native plants is that they haven't been, I don't know how to say tampered with, but they haven't had any human interference in terms of breeding. So, horticulturalists, they work with plants and develop these cultivars that maybe have special characteristics, like a certain flower color or something like that. But native plants have been untouched in that way. Now, horticulturists do develop cultivars of native plants. And how you can tell is, like, if you're at a nursery, you'll see the scientific name, the Latin name, which is genus and species. And then in kind of quotation marks, there'll be some sort of whimsical name in English, which is the name of that cultivar. And some of these are cultivars of our own native plants. But these often don't provide the same wildlife benefits because they've been altered. So I won't get into that too much, but I just wanted to give you just a basic lay of the land on native plants. And if you have questions about what's native, two sites are provided here. SignNet, and the plants database are two good sites where you can look up a plant. And I think you can look it up by scientific name or common name, and then you can see whether it's native, introduced, or invasive. So just some general thoughts on native plants. Now, on this next slide, I want to offer a variety of reasons to ponder, and some may resonate with you more than others. And it's just sort of some different thoughts to consider as far as why you might want to incorporate more natives into your yard. Or if you have a neighbor or friend who's not sure why it's important, and they don't maybe have a lot of natives, what are some things you can bring up to help people think more about that? And so ecological, we've touched on that a bit already. The idea is that there's lots of research that shows that our native plants provide more benefit to wildlife than non-natives. So this is important as far as providing habitat at home. And habitat at home is becoming more and more important because our wildlands are under so many threats and pressures. We've seen devastating fires just recently. We're in the middle of a drought. We have climate change that's also magnifying those changes. And then we have development. And so all those things are shrinking and threatening the wildlands. So it's making habitat at home more important than it's ever been. And there's an author, Doug Tallamy, who's written a lot about this. And some of the things he says, they really resonate with me, where he says, what we choose to put in our yards, what plants we choose to put in our yards determines what can live around us, what insects can be in the area, what birds can be in the area. So that, I think, is a pretty strong set of arguments there. Also, from an economic standpoint, if you use more native plants, you're going to save money on water because most natives are very drought adapted. You're going to use less fertilizer. So those are some economic considerations. Also, tourism dollars. A lot of people come to Arizona because they love to see our natural environment, and the more that we can do our part to preserve that is helping in terms of the economic benefits. Then you have health benefits as well. If you're using less pesticides or fertilizers, you're adding less toxins into the environment. The idea of a living landscape at home, there's so much enjoyment in that, being able to sit out and view wildlife. There's a lot of benefits that have been documented for human health, everything from lowered blood pressure to better immune function and mood. So there's so many benefits in terms of health. Also, a lot of our native plants have great medicinal value, and some of which hasn't even been fully explored or researched. So that's another thing as well to consider. And then getting even more philosophical, from sort of a moral standpoint, we can think about all living things having an intrinsic value. And so native plants, they have lots of extrinsic values, like we just talked about with their economic value or their health value, but in and of themselves, they have value just in being. And so the more we can preserve them. And then also just, considerations in the spiritual realm. Most spiritual traditions have some values around nature and the interconnectedness of all living things. So by participating in that in like a living landscape at home, kind of speaks to that. And then also, once you have a living landscape home, it's a great place for spiritual practices, whether that might be meditation or yoga or prayer. So just a whole gamut of things to think about as far as why you might want to incorporate natives. So I'm just going to briefly overview 4 of the main plant groups that are in the Sonoran Desert. Quickly just overview these. Especially for folks who may be newer to the Valley. And these are some of our largest groups in terms of numbers of plant species. And so that'll be the cacti, grasses, the legumes, and the asters. And there's a representative of each on this slide. But I want to point out that this is not in any way an exhaustive list of plants. There's many more families of plants besides these 4. So, but it just gives us a little bit of a flavor. As far as the cacti, we have over 300 species in the Sonoran Desert and 80 in Maricopa County. Lots of examples. I'm sure you're familiar with saguaro and some others. What's really interesting about them is they're bee pollinated by some of our native solitary bees, not honeybees. There's many different types of native bees that we have. in the Sonoran Desert, and some of them specialize in cacti. That means they only utilize cactus flowers. So that's really, really interesting. And of course, these are very low water and full sun plants, but they often need some filtered shade or sun in the summertime, especially when they're young. The grasses are a little bit overlooked. We have over 200 species here in Maricopa County. Some of them, though, are invasive, unfortunately. What some of the invasives we have, some of the worst ones we have are some of the grasses, but the ones I list are natives, and there's lots of good native grasses to incorporate into your yard. They have different life forms. Some are like a bunch grass, like this picture of the Sidotes grama. That's a bunch grass. They grow in clumps. Others are more like annuals, and they do their whole life cycle in just a few weeks. And there are others that are large and like shrubs. They have a lot of value, and I think they're overlooked. You know, they're important for grays, for many types of mammals, but also some grasses serve as host plants for butterflies, some of the skipper butterflies. So they're really valuable in terms of that as well. So just another thing. And I think not a lot of people incorporate native grasses into their landscape. When I do see them, it's usually introduced grasses. The legumes are another important group in Maricopa County and in the Sonoran Desert. They come in a range of different types of plants. Mesquites, ironwoods, and palo verde and acacias are all trees. And then we have dahlias and sennas, which are shrubs, and lupins, which are a type of wildflower. So they run across the range of life forms, habits. What some of the ways they're important, many are nectar plants. They provide a lot of nectar for pollinators. This acacia, Catclaw acacia, when it's blooming in May, it's a real bee magnet, April, May, and it's very fragrant. Also, a lot of the legumes are host plants for butterflies. And I mentioned that a few times maybe, but I haven't said what that is. And that means that when the adult females lay their eggs, they'll only lay them on typically one type of plant or a group of plants. And so they will not reproduce without those host plants present. And then the caterpillars or larvae will eat down some of the leaves of the plant and go through their stage of life until they're ready to go into the chrysalis and become a butterfly. So host plants are important. And just in general, the legumes are considered keystone species. They're plants that have an outsized role in the environment, which means that if they were taken away, the impacts would be pretty high. There's a lot of reasons legumes are important, some that I've mentioned already, and then this idea that they are nitrogen fixers, which means that they have a relationship, and here's the native plant and bacteria relationship. They have a relationship with bacteria that live in their roots, and these bacteria are able to fix nitrogen. They're actually able to pull atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into a form that can be used in the soil. And as we know, nitrogen is an important component for plant growth. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of the legumes are considered keystone species, as well as the other reasons. And they're typically, again, full sun and low water species. And the last group we'll profile, you probably see these really often because they're one of the largest flowering families worldwide, the composites. And their defining characteristic is that what you think is a one flower head, like think of a sunflower, that's actually many flowers put together, each yielding seeds. And we have over 260 species of them in Maricopa County, and they're often referred to as darn yellow composites because they mostly come in the color yellow, and they can be hard to tell apart. And in fact, some of that can really irk botanists. They have to go down to kind of real detailed levels to tell them apart. And so the pictures up there are various composites that are native here. I did put up a few that are not yellow to remind us that they aren't all yellow, but quite a lot of them are yellow, and you'll be surprised when you start looking. And they're really good nectar plants. Some of them are larval host plants for butterflies, and they're also, a lot of them are important for producing seed for birds. So that was just a really quick run through of four families of plants in the Sonoran Desert. I do have a couple of links here. I think hopefully we'll send out the PowerPoint, or I'll make the PowerPoint available on the website as well. We have some palettes that you can look at that are like suggested plants to get started for your garden, not even having to grow from seed, but ones that you should be available in nurseries. And then I have profiles of plants in the seed library. So now I'm going to talk about native plant germination. So if you do want to grow from seed, what are some of the things that are involved in that? And I have to say that, just to caution you, that it's not necessarily easy to grow native plants from seed. Um, it's not impossible, but it's not. If you've ever grown vegetables from seed and started, lettuce or tomatoes or whatever, they typically, you put them in, you sow them, and in 7 to 10 days later, almost all of them have germinated. It's not going to be the same exact experience with native seeds, and that's because um, we have artificially selected vegetable and agricultural crops over centuries to germinate quickly. We keep selecting the ones that germinate quickly and reproducing those, and then you have a whole line, a whole species that has that trait. But that's not true for native plants. Just the opposite is true, that to protect themselves, to sort of hedge their bets, they have adaptations that will prevent them from germinating unless the conditions are right. Because if they germinate when it's too hot or too dry, they're not going to make it. So it's a protection for them. So what makes it harder for us is something that benefits them. So it's harder for us to break the dormancy. And we'll talk about stratification and scarification, which are two of the primary methods for treating seeds, and it depends on the seed. If I knew the technique for the seed, I provide that information for the seed library. For the plant, if you pick up the packet, it's on the packet, it's on the website. But not all techniques are not known for all species. So, but there are some general things we can talk about what clues there could be about what type of treatment it might need. And then there are some that actually do not have dormancy, and they can be planted at any time without pre-treatment. So we'll go through those. So starting with scarification. So a lot of seed coats, if the seed has like hard seed coat, that means it's impenetrable to water and oxygen, and it cannot germinate without that. So scarification is a way to break that dormancy. So that the seed will germinate. And there's 3 overall techniques. I typically use mechanical, but I've also used heat. I've not used the chemical. I've not used sulfuric acid, but I just mentioned it for completeness. But mechanical would be like taking a metal file and just gently kind of scraping the seed. And you might see you wear off the seed coat, and it might look more like a lighter color underneath. Sandpaper there I think that one, that was the only type I had at home just to take the picture, but I think a little bit of a coarser grain, but not too coarse, would be good. Heat. So not boiling water, because that can damage the seed, because the seed, remember, it is alive in there. But near boiling water, and putting the seeds in near boiling water will help them will scarify, will help break down that coat. And then that should help break, the dormancy. The important thing that I left out is about the mechanicals. If you do the metal files or sandpaper, you would then soak the seed after that, because you've disrupted the coat, and now you're letting the water get in there. And so often I've had ones that will, because I'll leave them maybe in the water, maybe overnight, and or a little bit longer. Some of the seeds will start to germinate in the water, even sometimes, a few times it's happened to me. So that is good for hard-seeded species. Now, stratification, I have a picture of a bag that I set up that's now in my refrigerator for rose seeds that are going through stratification. For stratification, what we're doing is we're mimicking the natural environment that the seeds require. So, and this is mostly for like seeds that germinate in the springtime. Especially here in the Sonoran Desert. So what's going on is a lot of the seeds, like let's say wildflower seeds, they need to go through a cold, moist period. So winter rains and colder temperatures to germinate. And if you can either choose to sow those seeds in the fall and have natural stratification over the winter, or you can do it artificially with your refrigerator, and that's called cold moist stratification. So what you're doing is you're taking the seeds, you're taking some sand, and you're moistening it. You can also do it with paper towels, but I've just used sand and mixing the seeds in with the sand, getting it moist, and then putting it in the refrigerator for the amount of days recommended. Usually 30 to 60 days, although I have seen 90 days as recommended for some species. And you may also start to see the seeds start to germinate in the bag. And that's a clue that it's time to get them out and planted. Warm moist stratification, I really just put that more in for completeness, I guess. That's not really a method or requirement I've seen of species here in the Sonoran Desert. It's typically the cold moist stratification. And a lot of the wildflowers require that. But you can, again, do it naturally by planting them at the right time. Then you have some species that actually require both scarification and stratification because they have double dormancy. So that's another complication. So there are some seeds that don't require pre-treatment because they don't have dormancy, and I list a few there that are known not to have a dormancy, so they wouldn't require stratification or scarification. Just quickly, a little bit of information on seed sowing techniques. You can sow indoors, you can sow outdoors, or you can do what's called planting germinants, which I think we kind of touched on a little bit here. With indoor sowing, I like that because you can control the conditions better, because you can maintain, it's easier to maintain a moist environment, a constant moist environment for germination. You start out by making sure your medium is pre-moist and you don't want to put seeds into dry medium. Plant the seeds 2 to 4 times as deep as their diameter. Don't bury them, just press them in. And then you can put like a type of mulch over the top, except if the seeds are really tiny. Those typically need light to germinate, so I wouldn't use that. And then you can, have them in a sunny place. If you have a heat mat or something like that, there's lots of different, add-ons you can do, but that's the general idea. And so you start them indoors and then transplant them out. I do this with a lot of things in the seed library. I've had good success because I can control the conditions more. Whereas if I'm sowing outdoors, I have to keep the soil, pretty moist regularly, which is hard here because it's so arid and dries out even if I'm watering it daily. But direct sowing outdoors, is more natural, I suppose. You can sow directly into any unamended soil. There's some good, Native Seed Search has some good instructions on how to do that. And as far as this other technique, so how we were talking about, the stratification in the bags in the refrigerator, if you start to see the seeds germinating, so you have the seed and the little, the radical coming out, the start of the root, what you can do there is you can then transplant those from the bag into, I would go with direct sowing indoors. So also there's some seeds that you don't have to stratify, but will germinate quicker if you put them in a Ziploc bag with a little bit of like a paper towel, a moist paper towel, and a Ziploc bag, and keep it closed for a few days, like sunflowers and milkweeds for me have germinated faster that way. So then if you start seeing those germinate, you can move them into and plant them down. And so you just have that part. I've lost a lot of seeds. It's a little hard because you have to kind of get them in the right position with the root facing downward, and they're very tender. But it has worked for me. I've gotten things that I've got germinants that I've then planted into indoor, into little cups indoors, and then finally move them outside. So all that is possible. As far as the potting medium or mulch, you shouldn't use regular soil to grow, to start seeds in. There are special seed starting mixes you can buy. I've seen them at Home Depot and Lowe's, or you can make your own with 1 part perlite or vermiculite. Those help with drainage. The vermiculite's a white and perlite's a brown. Both of those I've seen at the same stores. And then with 1 part peat moss, and peat moss isn't really sustainable. So coconut coir is another choice if you can find it. I think I had to get it online to make your own. And then we mentioned the mulch. That's worked for me okay, but poultry grit, I had a lot of mold developing on that, and that's always a problem with indoors. And if the seeds get too wet, especially, it's hard to keep control the level. You don't want too much water, but you don't want too little. And then if you get too much water, you'll start getting mold on top of your seeds where the mulch is. Seed balls is another possible way to consider germinating seeds, but I'm kind of smiling a little bit because I've actually been discouraged about it lately, because I've done a project since July with seed balls and haven't had much germination, and it was mostly because of drought. But the idea is that you encase the seed in a mixture of clay and compost, and then you put them out and you just plant them, like you just lay them on the surface of the soil and forget about them. But nothing's going to happen if there's no rain, because you got to dissipate that clay. The clay protects the seeds from drying out, or from ants or birds taking the seeds away. Ants can really decimate seed sowing efforts as well. So I'm a little bit discouraged about seed balls right now because of drought, but they have been used over a long period of time in a lot of settings. And I'd say if you want to try that, what I'm discovering, and there's a recipe there in that link from the extension, and I've talked to the person that wrote that, the author of that, and she's saying, yeah, go with less clay, because then you don't need as much rain to get them to break down. So there's definitely, if doing all this scarification and stratification is daunting, and it can be, there's a lot of plants that will grow without all those techniques. And I list a few that are from the seed library, and we also have others that you can get more information about, but those are some of the ones I've had the most success with. All of these I've grown from seed, quite a few plants, and a lot of them are in my garden now. So I didn't keep good track of the time. I have no idea where I stood on the time, because I couldn't see that with the screen sharing. Hopefully I didn't get too far in, so we have enough time for questions. But I'll just talk about this one slide here. These are just some good sources. The bottom one is a book that's all about germinating different natives. So just wanted to put that up as well. And I think this is the point where, Cathy, do you want to go through the other two slides, or are we going to the Q&A?
We have time to go to the next two slides. We'll
Okay,
move really quickly, I promise. So thank you so much, Danielle. That was really very informative, and I learned a lot. And I wanted to share with everyone that Audubon has made available a very helpful resource, the Plants for Birds database. And so you've heard a lot tonight about the different plants you can plant, and maybe you're thinking, well, gosh, what do I do? And I want a vine, or I want a tree, and here's your place. So it's a free tool to use. You just put in your email address and your zip code, and you will get a list of native plants that are of a special benefit to birds. Next slide. And this picture shows that in addition to the list, you're also given some resources. So if you're wondering where you can go in your area to get native plants or native seeds, the tab at the top for local resources is very, very helpful. You'll also note that below those tabs is the searchable engine. So you can basically say, hey, I want a vine, or I want a tree, or I want to attract this type of bird, or I want nectar, or I want nuts, or whatever it is, and you can use those filters to get the plants, the native plants in your area. So it's pretty cool. If you have any questions or want further information, feel free to shoot me an email. My email address is there. And yeah, that's about it. I think we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, that's a great site, Cathy.
I think so. Thank you. I didn't make it though. I can't take credit for it, but I do like it.
Audubon did great work.
Thank you so much, Danielle and Cathy. That was awesome. I learned a ton. And if there's anything I like more than bird pictures, it's flower pictures. So that was really lovely to see all those great plant pictures. I do have a couple of questions that have been coming in, and if anybody else has more questions, feel free to type them into the chat and I can field them to everybody. Just before we get going with the Q&A, I just wanted to, since I know some people might have to duck out a little bit early, just thanks for everyone for attending. Be sure to sign up for, like I said, the newsletter, or follow us on social media for future webinars. And the next one we have coming up is in 2 weeks, talking about conservation, ranching, and grassland conservation. That's too many words. But looks like we've got a couple of questions. And I will kind of let Danielle and Cathy just figure out who wants to answer which question. So one that I had was, where did they go? How do native plants help with climate change?
I'm just kind of pondering the best answer to that. Well, I mean, plants, it's hard to focus in laser on native plants with that. I'd have to think about it a little more to come up with the best argument there. But I'd say just plants in general, especially shade plants, can really help with the heat island effect, which is going to be huge here. It is already huge here. And I would say that some of our native trees are some of the best ones for helping with the heat island effect here, especially if you can have on your west side of your homes, mesquites or ironwoods, you're going to be in much better shape.
Cool. Anything to add, Cathy? Or
No.
Okay.
Not really. It's a tough question. I mean, there's a lot of kind of more nebulous connections, but I think Danielle did a good job.
Awesome. Thanks. So another question we have was from a participant who said they have water irrigation. What kind of plants would work with that? Any native grasses?
So I'm wondering, when you say water irrigation, do you mean flood irrigation, drip irrigation? What type specifically, or just mean irrigation in general?
Suzanne, if you either want to unmute or put your question, clarify your question in the chat, that can help Danielle answer it.
I have flood irrigation. I live on a little over an acre, and I have flood irrigation like every 2 weeks in the summer, every month in the winter, and like 3 weeks in the shoulder seasons. And a lot of things don't work. It seems more like a riparian habitat.
That's interesting. Yeah, so probably you wouldn't want any of the cacti or succulents and things like that, or the real xeric plants, but I have, I'm just outside the flood irrigation zone. I go bicycling in the neighborhood next door, and there's a real great native plant enthusiast there who's on flood irrigation, and she has the most marvelous wildflower meadow I've ever seen. And I go by there all the time to admire it. She has chocolate flowers, blanket flowers, oh God, there's flax. I mean, there's like 10 different, at least 10 verbenas, and they make it all summer long. They look wonderful. Whereas, over here, everything's struggling where I am. So I think you can do some sort of a wildflower meadow there.
Okay, so far I've just been doing trees. I've been afraid of flowers because I feel like they're just going to get, totally inundated. But I'd like to do flowers. I'd like to have a little meadow, a little butterfly garden.
And if you contact me privately, I can't remember the name of the street she's on, but she's right off of 56th Street between Sweetwater and Thunderbird. It's right in that area. And if you were ever in that area, you drove by, you could see. And sometimes she's out there tending the garden, and I think she'd be happy to answer any questions, but I don't remember her name at this time.
Thank you.
Great. So Janet was wondering, do you have any tips for starting creosote from seed?
That's one I don't have in the seed library, but I'm thinking about adding it. But what I do know about it is that it volunteers everywhere in my yard. So that means that it's setting its own seed, and I'm getting, new plants coming up all the time. So whatever I'm doing, whatever my conditions are, they're good for creosote. I would say, if you already have a creosote, you might start seeing volunteers. Or you specifically want to grow it from seed?
Janet, do you want to clarify your question at all? She said she just planted a little one, but she wants more.
So that one, I would have to look at the seed. Go ahead and open, if you have some seeds, take a look at them. If they're hard seeded, they might require scarification. And that's my guess, because I think I've looked at them cursorily before. But that happens naturally in nature, through different processes. And that's obviously happening in my yard. So I can't tell you more than that because I haven't tried to germinate that one.
My experience has been that they self-seed,
Yeah.
sometimes where you don't want them.
Yes.
But they'll do so readily. I mean, they know when to grow, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, Barbara was wondering, how does the Native Plant Library work? Can we purchase seeds online from it?
So it's set up as an honor system. In the physical seed libraries, you come in and we ask people not to take more than 3 packets a month, and there's no charge. And then, like I said, I do have a temporary mail order, but that's going to be ending in a couple of weeks. And that's been 3 packets for $1 just to cover our shipping and handling. So if you want to order them online, I would do it by mid-April is probably when I'm going to have to take that down. But the physical libraries will stay up.
Great. And I do know that many other communities outside of Phoenix also have seed libraries. Like I know that in New Mexico, the Albuquerque Public Libraries have a really big seed library resource. Up in Santa Fe. And many communities have small, almost like little libraries for books, but they're popping up around neighborhoods. So if you don't happen to live in the same neighborhood, I would go check it out. Oh, this is a related question, but Lori wants to know, can we donate seeds to the library?
Yes, but I'd have to, it would have to be very specific things. Certain guidelines. I haven't put that on the web yet, but if anybody's interested, contact me. I am looking for seeds, but of plants that are already in the seed library. I don't want to be adding, if I'm going to add something, there's a whole process involved in creating materials for that species. So I don't want one-off things. It's got to be something that I already have or something that I really want to add. So if folks are interested, just please contact me directly to have those conversations.
Great. Cathy, do you know of any other like seed exchanges or seed resources around the community?
Not specifically for native seeds. I know that the Phoenix city libraries have a seed library, but I think there's some native seeds, but I think it's mostly vegetables. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I'm sure there's lots of resources around everyone's different communities. So Lori's asking, I have some narrow leaf seeds from my garden. She's grown them for the last 5 years. Is it some say it's too late to start narrow leaf milkweed from seed this season? If not, is there a seed that falls into that moist stratification method? Oh, it looks like maybe we lost Danielle.
Oh no. Well, I can kind of cover that just with my limited experience. We did not have a whole lot of luck growing milkweed this late. I mean, unless you really are willing to baby them, like grow them inside, do the little bag method, and just really keep them protected from the high heat. They don't like that. They don't like to dry out, at least not when they're little. And then they're okay. Like I would start them, care for them inside, and then plant them in the fall.
Great. Let's see. Do you think you can answer a question about globe mallow, Kathy? Is it easy to plant globe mallow from seed? Is there a difference in difficulty between the different colors?
Again, I'm not an expert, but in my experience, and we have a number of different colors at Rio Salado, and they self-seed very easily. And they're a pretty tough plant. They're another one that comes up where you don't necessarily want it, but they do self-seed. And I have taken the seeds and just spread them in places and they come up. So I'd go for it. And I haven't noticed a difference in the colors.
Yeah, we have a lot of globe mallow over in New Mexico as well. And I always feel bad when they're growing not in the place I want them to grow in my yard. Let's see, Elizabeth is wondering, am I able to purchase seeds from the Maricopa Seed Library, even though I don't live in Maricopa County, but I live somewhere else in Arizona? I don't know if you can answer that, Kathy.
I don't honestly know of another native seed library. So I'm reading over the question again to make sure that I'm
We can also send this to Danielle and include it in the follow-up email.
She would know. I would send it to her just to verify.
Great. Looks like we might just have another 1 or 2 questions. Where is there a place to purchase native plants, not seeds? Have any suggestions?
Yes. So remember that website I showed? You can put in your zip code and get a list of the kind of known places where you can go and buy plants near you. And then there's also online resources there as well. So even if you're out in the middle of nowhere, you can at least mail order them. I've never done that with a plant, but people do it if you have no other options.
Yeah, the Audubon Plants for Birds database is definitely a great resource, I find. It tells you what to buy, what birds it attracts, and some local nurseries that you can call them up, and I would just check to see what they've got. I know a lot of nurseries are kind of up in the air with COVID these days.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Katie. I think definitely calling ahead. If you have something in mind, call the nursery ahead and see if they have it. It's a good bet.
Yeah. Great. I guess this is like the last call for questions for either myself or for Kathy. And if you have any for Danielle, we can try to send them along. Like I said before, we will send out a recording of this and we'll try to get Danielle's slides because she had so many wonderful resources in those slides themselves. I tried to put some of the links in the chat, but don't worry if you missed a couple of them, we'll send them out again. And I will just make one last plug again. If you enjoyed tonight's program and you feel moved, we really appreciate donations and your support to help us continue to offer these programs for free to both yourselves and other members of our community. So great, looks like no other questions. So thank you everybody so much for coming. We hope you have a good evening and happy spring planting. Bye-bye.